Almighty God, we thank you for your many gifts. We ask you to bless us in our time together, Lord, as we learn about the land where you walked. Help us in so doing to learn more about you. We pray in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, friends, so today we're kind of honing in as we progress through the trip. We're not doing everything quite in the chronological order we did everything, but we're kind of honing in, working our way roughly from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so next week we'll talk about Jerusalem and the things there, which is really kind of the high point of the trip for me. And I think I intentionally structured trips so that you go to Jerusalem last, because I mean the most important things that happen in human history happen there, namely Jesus' death and resurrection. So today we're going to work our way down towards, we're going to talk about some things in and around Jerusalem. We're going to start talking about some things in Jerusalem, but we're not going to talk about the events related to Jesus' death and resurrection just yet. So if you want that, come back next week. I've tried to put a picture of the trip up. I didn't have a picture of our group that I haven't already shown you with everybody in it, but that's the 4 ministers that were on the trip. The man next to me is Michael from he was pastor of Advent Church in Greenville. Next to him is Will, pastor of Central Church in Florence. And the 3 of us were the ones that it was our trip. And then Laura Allen Curlin is next to Will, and she is the associate at Advent. And they had enough people from Advent that they got more than one comp. So she was his other comp. I tell you, I told Laura Allen, I said, you don't know, you got a good boss. He took you to the Holy Land, so, But, and we'll talk more about this place in a minute, but that is the Judean desert between Jerusalem and Jericho. And we're going to talk more about that location in a minute, but that ended up being one of the neatest places we went. So we're going to start out today in Bethlehem. Now, I will say, I want to read from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. So Bethlehem now is a big city, but at the time was not. It's the place where David was born and raised. It's the place where Jesus was from. And most associated with those two, for the obvious reasons, David was the king of Israel and then Jesus was promised to be his heir and to fulfill the same sort of role of kingship that Jesus played, to be a second David in a way. And so Bethlehem is the city of David. It's also the city of Jesus. Something I said last week, I want to clarify. I got my timelines a little crisscrossed on the spot. Jesus was born using the calendar that we have now. Even the month that figured it missed it a little bit. Jesus was born between 9 and 4 BC. So anywhere from, say, 9 to 4 years, either side of 0, or the other side of 0 is when Jesus was born, from the way we date it. So,
I'm sorry, I'm not... From 4 BC to 9?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So that 13 years span?
Well, 4, 5, 6, 5-year span. You go backwards from 0.
I know 4 BC.
To 9 BC.
To 9 BC.
9 BC, that's what I...
Oh, okay.
I said 9.
Oh, 980. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So,
You're making me do think of
I know,
timeline in my head and do algebra.
I know. Okay.
When I start doing BC, every time I write it, I'm like, wait a minute, how can the big number come first? Oh, yeah. I mean, I have to do that every time.
Okay.
But so somewhere in that 9 BC to 4 BC.
Thank you.
And part of that is we know of an astronomical event that would have potentially been what the wise men saw that was around 7 BC. So in between the sort of internal timeline that the Bible uses, we know of this astronomical event that took place that the Magi could have seen and taken as a sign to come. So,
What was that?
it was it's like Saturn and Jupiter.
Yeah,
Jupiter?
Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all 3 of them lined up together.
Right, and so it made the sky really, really bright. So it looked like one star, and they would have one of those. I don't remember which one off the top of my. I need to research these things before I start talking about it. I did. I just didn't write it down. But one of those was associated with God, the father of Jesus. So, all right. So, Jerusalem, Bethlehem. Bethlehem now, if you go to Bethlehem now, there's basically, it's like just Jerusalem continued. It's kind of like Charleston and Mount Pleasant, Camden and Lugoff. I mean, it's just, see what it did there, Camden, Lugoff. It just keeps going. It's like one, but it's in Palestinian territory. It's a different municipality. It's in Palestinian control. So it's not far from Jerusalem at all, even in Jesus' day. So by the 2nd century, though, AD, so the 100s, the early Christian leader Justin Martyr talks about Jesus being born in a cave. This area is filled with naturally occurring caves, and he talks about Jesus being born in one of those. And in this area, those caves would have been used as stables. And not stables, maybe not the right word, because I think of a stable as something that housed horses, but a safe place from the elements which you would keep any animals, including a horse. But these caves that were naturally occurring around Bethlehem would have been used by the local inhabitants for animals. And if Joseph was from Bethlehem, which seems you could make a case that he is, if Joseph is originally from Bethlehem, he and Mary, when they go back for the census we read about in Luke 2, we're potentially staying with Joseph's family. One of the ways we translate, we all have the image, largely because of the way the King James is translated, that there was no room for them in the inn. And we think of the innkeeper turning them away. Another way to translate that that's just as accurate is there's no room for them in the guest house. So they could have potentially been going to stay with Joseph's family, but everybody else was there for the census as well, and there was not a lot of room for them. And then the being in the stable in the cave may have actually been sort of an act of mercy. Mary is about to have a baby, and you've got a house full of people, and this is all very new to her. Remember, she's a virgin when all this is happening to her. She's young, she's scared. Maybe that was a place that would have been remote and safe, away from the prying eyes of family and all the aunts who would have been there that would have known exactly what the right thing to do was. So it used to bother me. It came for a period of time to bother me to think, why did God make Mary have a baby in a barn? But she was, if we think of it, again, you're kind of going outside the bounds of Scripture proper, but if we think of it in terms of she was with Joseph's family in a place that was dry and warm and safe and away from prying eyes and curious eyes, maybe it was a sign of grace that she was able to have her baby in this place. They may have run the animals out even. We all had our children's book. The animals were right there. In our Christmas carols, the sheep was watching, they were all, but maybe this was just a place that they created for Mary to have her baby anyway, these caves, Christians were worshiping in one of these caves and revering it as the birthplace of Jesus in the 2nd century. Now, this is awesome and funny at the same time. So in the year 135, after the Jewish revolt, the Romans turned one of these caves to stop Christians from worshiping there. The Romans turned one of these caves into a fertility shrine. And in so doing, in turning it into a pagan place of worship, they were able to stake a claim that this is the place where Christians of the first generations were revering as Jesus' birthplace. They marked it. Had the Romans not marked it, had the Romans not decided to build a pagan worship place there, we might not know which cave it was. But because the Romans said, we got to stop these Christians from worshiping here, Aphrodite, shrine, now, they marked it. And so it's ironic that in trying to stop worship there, they preserved worship there. So when St. Helena, mother of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, went to Bethlehem, she was able to say, well, where was Jesus born? They're going to say, well, that stupid fertility shrine over there.
So is it where the church
And that's where the Church of the Nativity is. And we're going to show the pictures in it. So she built a church there in 339 over the cave that the Christians were remembering as the birthplace of Jesus. We're going to look at it in a minute. And The current church was built in 529. The mosaics that are under the floor, I'll kind of show you a picture of those sort of that are under the floor now are from the 339 church. The walls and the roof are from the 529 church. Now, the Persians conquered what's now Israel in the early 7th century, but they spared this church. This is the Church of the Nativity, and they spared the Church of the Nativity because in the mosaics, the Magi, the wise men, looked kind of Persian, and so they spared it. They thought, well, they're honoring Persians, so we'll spare this church. So when you go here, you are going to the oldest church in the Holy Land, well, the oldest building in the Holy Land. This is probably the oldest building those of you who've been will ever walk in, unless you go to the Parthenon or somewhere, and that doesn't have a roof on it. So, but this is an intact building that Christians have been worshiping in since, as it is more or less right now, since 529.
Does that encompass the whole scene, or is that just the one in the middle?
Okay, just this right here. This is the Church of the Nativity. This is part of the complex back here, and you can't see it, but over here is, the Church of the Nativity is a Greek Orthodox church, and there's a Catholic church next to it. And the Catholic church is like from the 19th century. It really doesn't have a lot of historical value other than the Catholics saying, we don't have a church in Bethlehem, we got to fix that. So, so this is Nativity Square in front of the Church of the Nativity. And I'll show you some pictures that you can see a little bit better. This area here, you can go one way and go to the Catholic church, or one way and go to the Orthodox church. But the Church of the Nativity is the Greek Orthodox church. This is an old picture postcard I found of it that I thought made it, I don't know, it was just an old picture postcard. And I didn't know this, it's just kind of funny that it was a postcard that somebody took a picture of and put in Google Images. But this is you can see though, this is the Catholic church right here. This spire over is the Catholic church. Now this little door is the door into the nave, the sanctuary seating area of the Orthodox church. And you'll notice there's an arch here that's been bricked in, and there's a really low lintel. Like if you're my height, you just about have to bend over double to walk in. Now, a tour guide may tell you that this was filled in so that when you walk in, you have to bow as you enter the place that honors Jesus' birth. And that's a lovely story. And it's a story. The reality is that during the era, the Turkish era, in the early Turkish era, when the Turks took over this part of the world, they would sort of abuse the church and Christians by riding their horses in and out of the space. And you can't ride your horse through that little bitty door. You can't lead a horse even through that little bitty door. So that it's kind of a renovation they did, to thwart authority. So anyway, but it is neat. It's like one of those twice told tales. Like if you go on a carriage tour in Charleston, they'll tell you the reason that, men would go up these stairs, women these stairs. No, they just did double stairs because it looked good. So that's the nave, the interior of the Church of the Nativity, and I struggled to find a good picture. They're doing extensive renovations there now, and so when we went, Jim and Anna and Mike could tell you, this was all scaffolding, and we really couldn't see. Now, I will say that I've been to here twice, and I had very different experiences. The first time was a spiritual high point. This past time was not.
Yeah.
And it's not just because of the scaffolding. It was crowded, it was jostling. Eastern Europeans have a very different sense of what it means to stand in line and wait your turn. In other words, they don't. They just, and it's cultural, but hey, I'm an American and I wanted them to wait their turn. So it looks dark, and I like the way the light played on this. It looks dark, but this would have been a riotously bright space when it was built. White plaster and mosaics. And we'll see some of the restored mosaics that we didn't even get to see, y'all, but that they were working on while we were there. But so this door where the floor opens up right here, these are trap doors that you can see the mosaic floor from the 339 church that are preserved. And this was an ancient preservation effort that they built a floor over that to preserve those mosaics. And so what you see here is a church in the Byzantine design, which is not unlike the Western design. The biggest thing is, and we'll show the altar, the front, a little more clearly in a minute, but you have ambulatory around the side, one big nave. Interestingly, the lights would have been traditionally olive oil. Western churches used candles, Eastern churches used olive oil. Part of that is wax melts in the heat. But so you see olive oil lamps everywhere, and they hang real low. I mean, they look like they're just, they're really low because they don't put off a lot of light. I felt like I was going to hit my head on them. This is some of the preserved mosaic, though. And you can see the restoration work. So we were walking around under this scaffolding, not able to see any of it. Now, that's bright. I mean, see how bright that is, how colorful that is? That's what the church would have looked like in the 6th century. And over the years, soot from candles and hot breath from people, weather changes, not to mention Turks using it at various times to put animals in, just meant that over the, this was 10 years ago, this was a building in danger of basically having to be condemned, or millions of dollars. And so there's been an international effort to preserve this building. I mean, I think even UNESCO is involved with it. So it's not even just a Christian thing, but just to be preserved is one of the great cultural sites for the human race, regardless of religion. So you can see the images of angels, and I mean, it's really intricate, what they've done. And so if you go back in another few years, we'll be able to hopefully see some of this as it was in the 6th century.
Did the Muslims in any way cover over that, over those mosaics, plaster like they did in the Great Mosque in Istanbul?
No.
No, this never was.
This was preserved as a church. Constant. This was not like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul
Right.
was converted to a mosque from a cathedral.
But
This
they left alone, they didn't do anything to it?
right.
I don't
right.
know why.
Well, part of it is who was in charge. The Turks did not take over this part of the world. Well, they took over early before they took over Constantinople. And I don't know, they did not appropriate, the Turks did not appropriate the symbols of the Holy Land the same way they appropriated Byzantine symbols. So, or just the cultural world of the Byzantines, I guess would be a better way. Anyway, so I don't know why, but they preserved it. And again, most of the churches in the Holy Land were destroyed during the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. But this was not because of the way the Magi's looked Persian. Magi, that's the plural, look Persian. So most of the churches you'll see are either Crusader or are from around the turn of the first millennium or second millennium, around 1000 to 1100. Most of them are Crusader churches, or this is not though. All right, so if you're looking at the front of the church, this is what we would call the chancel, they would call the sanctuary. You go to the right here, and you go down kind of where that light is, and you come to this door. And these steps take you to the cave that's directly under the altar, where the cave that we know was being, that we can with reasonable historical certainty say Jesus was born in. Now, we talked about the difference between historical sites and traditional sites. This is both. This is archaeologically, we can say with certainty this is the cave in which Jesus was born. Now, there's two pictures of what's in the cave. When you come down in there, there is an altar, and this star, and this is a close-up of it here. The star marks the spot where traditionally it was held. Jesus was born. Mary was there when Jesus was born. Now, I'm prepared to say this is the cave. It might be more of a stretch to say that's the spot in the cave, but still, that is the site that Christians have revered, that spot. We know since the 7th century, or 6th century rather, that where he was born. Interestingly, since this is a Greek Orthodox space, some of the things you'll see that make an Orthodox space different is icons. An icon in the Greek Orthodox world played the same role that stained glass windows might play for us. That the great cathedrals of Europe, they called the stained glass windows the every man's Bible in a world where people weren't literate. You could go in the cathedral and look at the stained glass windows and help understand the stories. And the icons do sort of the same thing. But in the Greek Orthodox world, the icon has an added role in that it's almost like a window. And it's as if you're looking into heaven somehow, seeing that saint or seeing that action. But they usually depict events. So this is an icon of the birth of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. They do have a donkey there and a calf. You see angels, wise men bringing gifts. And these hangings around it would be changed. Those are liturgical colors. Those are paraments, and those would be changed with the season. So
Are the icons painted or are they
they're,
mosaic?
most of them are painted on wood.
How many people fit in there?
Some of them are mosaic. You can put a dozen or so in there at a time. And there's a monk to tell you when it's time to leave. I do want to point out this icon right here. You can't see it very well. This is not black. Well, it is, but it was not originally painted black. This is Mary holding Jesus. The face is black, the hands are black. Over the years, it's another Greek Orthodox thing that you kiss an icon as a way to revere the saint that you're remembering in the icon. This icon is about 1,000 years old, and it was black from people touching it, kissing it, handling it, plus just the soot and things from candles and from lamps. And this silver they would put over it is called rizzi, R-I-Z-Z-I, and that's sort of an early medieval preservation attempt. You cover it with silver, and that helps preserve the icon. I like icons. I have a very less than modest collection of icons. All right, so any questions? We're going to go to the next site we went to, sort of in the neighborhood near Bethlehem. Are there questions you have about the Church of the Nativity?
The date on that compared to the dates you gave earlier, what approximate time for this?
The cave?
This is the cave,
Basically
so it's the same date.
5:59, 5:29.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The icons obviously are not 5:29. There was a renovation at some point of the icons in the cave, and I don't know when that was. After we left the Church of the Nativity, we went just a few miles down the road to a town outside of Bethlehem called Bet-Sahur, and the Church of Shepherd's Field. And this is the site. This is a traditional site. It's probably not a historical site, but it's revered as the place where the shepherds, or where the angel appeared to the shepherds and told them to go to Bethlehem. This is a church that marks the location. It was built. It's a Catholic place. It was built in 1953, designed by the Italian architect Barluzzi, and he is a bigwig architect. So it's interesting. This church, though, he did some really neat things to mark this church as even to remember why we're worshiping that place. It's so you have here the shepherds, by the way, also would have used caves to shelter both themselves and the sheep. And so you have the angel over the door, and when you go into the sanctuary itself, it's another one where you sort of have worship in the round, where you have the altar immediately under a dome. Well, too much. And so if you go back to the first image, you also have the star. So you have all the images that heralded Christ's birth, the angel, the star resting over Bethlehem, and the church itself, you'll see, doesn't have windows on the first floor, making it reminiscent of a cave. The only light comes from above, like the opening of a cave. Beneath sort of the church, there is a cave that they've closed in, they've bricked over the front of and turned into a chapel. And that's the interior of the cave. Again, this is a traditional site. It may or may not be where the shepherds were sheltering the night that that was born. But whether it is the exact cave or not, it's like the place they may very well have been. And so altar there, we had a little remembrance there. And again, it's black, the roof is black from soot from people being in there. Maybe even fires that shepherds would have lit in there as they sheltered there during the get out of the storms. So some notes about the chapel though. It has 5, it's also built to look like a tent. There are these little, they're called apses, these that are sort of like, if you think about it, it's not just round, but it's like a series of half circles. There are 5 of those to mimic a tent, so that it would bring the idea of shepherds. Again, shepherds may be sheltering in a tent. So, because they would have followed the sheep. They would have. One thing I learned about sheep when I was in Texas over the summer is a good shepherd knows when to lead the sheep and when to let the sheep show him where water is. So you just kind of follow the sheep. They have a nose for water and don't need a lot of water. So sometimes they would have sat in caves when they could, tents when they couldn't. One other thing I learned in Texas when I helped Rick get up sheep is that I would be a terrible shepherd. Sheep, they went everywhere but the way I wanted them to go. All right. So any questions about Shepherd's Field or Bethlehem before we move to Jerusalem? All right. So let's talk about the temple and the Temple Mount. This is a scale model that you can go to outside of Jerusalem where it takes up a whole bunch of land, but it's a scale model as best as they've been able to recreate of what Jerusalem would have looked like at the time of Jesus. So if you imagine yourself sort of as God, it's like Legoland, you know, or like Godzilla. You know, I really wanted to walk around in there with a Godzilla suit, but they would have arrested me. But this is a reproduction, pretty reasonably accurate reproduction of what the temple at the time of Jesus would have looked like. We're going to talk about the Temple Mount, but the temple is there because that's what makes it important. Some things adjacent to the temple. This is the Antonia Fortress. This is a temple of Herod. A palace of Herod that was adjacent to the temple. We talk about the temple as Solomon's temple. The first temple was built by Solomon. We'll talk more about details in a minute, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. But what makes the Temple Mount so important, not just the building that was there, but the place itself so important. The Temple Mount is holy to the Jews because it's the site of the temple. It's holy to the Muslims because Muslims believe that it's from the top of the Temple Mount that Muhammad traveled to heaven and received some of the instructions from God, one of them being to pray 5 times a day. For Christians, it's holy because of the Jewish meaning and how that led to Jesus, but also because a lot of Jesus' ministry happened in and around the temple. The first disciples after the ascension spent time worshiping and teaching, but being in the temple. The temple is built on top of what we think was biblically Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah was the mountain where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. Interestingly, in Muslim tradition, the same story, only Abraham almost sacrificed Ishmael. So the first temple was built on the Temple Mount by Solomon in 586 BC. It was destroyed by the Babylonians when they took the Jews off into exile. But when the Persians overthrew the Babylonians and let the Jews return, the temple was rebuilt in 516 BC. So and then it experienced a major renovation under Herod the Great. He was a great builder. We looked at Masada. He built palaces there. He built Caesarea Maritima. He built a lot. And one of the things he did was a great renovation to the temple. Now, this is the temple Jesus would have known. But basically, if we think of this right here, think of this wall and everything in it as the temple proper. And think about all this stuff outside of it as sort of the temple complex. It's kind of like if you're thinking of a church building, this is the sanctuary and the rest of this is the campus around it. So interestingly, after the temple the Romans destroyed the temple after the Jewish revolt, and evicted all the Jews from Jerusalem and environs. And there was really nothing there for a long time. Byzantine Christians, so Eastern Christians, like the Greek Orthodox would have been the predominant Christian group, still are. But certainly in the time after the revolt and the growth of Christianity, they considered that the Temple Mount was cursed. So they didn't build anything there. They didn't want anything there. They used it as a quarry. But so there was no Christian drive to rebuild the temple or anything like that. It really wasn't, when we talk about sort of the Jewish roots of Christianity, it really wasn't until the 1900s that Christian theologians started paying attention to the fact that Jesus was a Jew. We kind of wanted to think of him as the last Jew that gave rise to all us good Christians. So what I mean is that was certainly the case back then. That would have been even more so the case in ancient times. So but it's just always interesting to me that Christians lived in this place where all this stuff happened in the life of Jesus, but the temple was like, oh, that's a Jewish place, it's cursed, we don't want anything to do with it. Seems off to me, but that's what they did. So to look at the temple diagram, though, to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. So we have the complex around it. Now, anybody could come into these courtyards here and here. If you read in Scripture about the court of the Gentiles, anybody could enter this place. But once you got to the temple proper, only Jewish people could enter. And the first courtyard you get to would be the women's court. Anybody, including women, could go that far into the temple. But then the next courtyard you would come into would be the men's court, and only men could go in that far. And that would include any Jewish boy who'd been bar mitzvahed. He could go in there. And the first altar is here. And a man would bring the sacrifice that he was going to offer there, whether it was an animal, whether it was grain, whatever it was, he would bring it there and it would be burnt on the altar. So to put it in perspective, this is the court of the women, and then behind here is the court of the men, and that's where the altar was. Now when you think of the altar, remember the altar is a big fire. Think of it kind of like a grill. When the psalm says, that a sacrifice, the sin of a sacrifice is pleasing to God, when your neighbor cooks a steak and you're eating something that's not a steak, isn't the scent pleasing? Imagine steak cooking in the temple when they throw the calf on or whatever. So the temple would have been behind this gate here. The altar rather would have been behind that gate into the next courtyard. And then the actually enclosed building itself, you would have had another level where you went into. You hear the porch of the temple. Let's look in this diagram. This is the porch of the temple. That's as far as anyone who was not a priest could go. Now, if you were a priest, you could come into this area, which was called the holy place, and there were lampstands. And for example, if you read in Leviticus, you see and again, the details of Solomon's temple, you see kind of outlined what it was supposed to be like. What they recreated here, before they built the temple, we're talking about pastoral people who were semi-nomadic. They moved, there was a tent that was like the temple that they moved around. And basically what they've done with the temple complex is recreate what they created with the tents. But, and then at the back of this space, you have another place, and you have the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was that held the Ten Commandments. It was separated by a big leather curtain from the rest of the place. And the only person that would go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest, and then only on Yom Kippur, which was the Day of Atonement, when he would go in there, because they believed if you were right here in the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant, you were in the presence of God. It was the only place on earth you could be fully in the presence of God. And so if anybody other than the high priest went back there, they'd be struck dead. If the high priest wasn't sort of prayed up and fasted up, and he went back there, he would die. As a matter of fact, they would tie, when the high priest went back there for Yom Kippur, you know where I'm going, they would tie a rope around his ankle so that if he dropped dead while he was in there, they could pull him out. Because if he dropped dead in there, nobody was going to go in there to get him. I mean, if he wasn't prayed up and he went in there, he got struck dead. So, interesting.
I always remember that. I mean, there's
The
so much
rope.
stuff. Yeah, it's,
It's just neat. I mean, it's like they thought about it.
I mean, I wish I would remember other stuff, but stuff like that.
But you've got to think at some point, one of the priests went, you know, Joachim, before you go back there, maybe we ought to tie a rope around your foot, you know? And somebody said, why didn't we think of that before? You know? All right, so that's sort of the outline of the temple. And this is the temple as Jesus would have known it. Now, if you go there now, obviously the sort of iconic thing you see that even stands out on the whole Jerusalem skyline is the Dome of the Rock, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and the Western Wall, which is not part of the skyline, but still predominant. So let's talk first about the Dome of the Rock. And there's an aerial view of as it looks now. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is excavated stuff from the time of Jesus, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But the Dome of the Rock covers the rock that was the threshing floor, where we think the threshing floor where David made a sacrifice that we see in 2 Samuel 24. That it was already a holy site at that time. And that's probably why the temple was built on Mount Moriah, was because that threshing floor, that rock, was there. But after the destruction of the temple, when the Muslims took over that, after the Muslim conquest, which hit what's now Israel around 638, or hit Jerusalem around 638, the Dome of the Rock was built over that rock. It was built from 688 to 691. Christians are not allowed to go in here. We're allowed to stand out the side and at the side. We're outside and look at it. When we went, by the way, we did not get to visit the Temple Mount. There were some security concerns, and they closed the Temple Mount. You may remember it was in the news. It was a big deal that no one is. So basically, the Muslims control what happens on top of the Temple Mount. The Jews, or the Israeli authorities, control access to the Temple Mount. And so it's just very careful compromise. You can't carry a Bible up there. They'll search your bag. And it's just to make sure that nobody gets mad and stabs anybody else, that kind of thing. But, and when I was there, so we got to go up there in 2008. We did not get to go there in 2018, which is a regret. And that just means we got to go back. But so this is an incredible building, though. Pictures don't do it justice. A gold-plated dome, this incredible Islamic mosaic that goes all the way around the building. This up here, this is all Arabic writing. Muslims don't do any kind of images in their worship. So you have this very stylized Arabic writing. And basically all the way around, it's a kind of strongly worded, while Muslims are right and Christians are wrong kind of thing. But the quote's very long. But so anyway, this building's basically been there more or less like that since 691. It's had a couple of updates over the years. There was a big one in the 20th century. The King of Jordan paid for a massive restoration of it. But when the Crusaders came, it was converted to a church. And basically all they did was put an altar in it. And then when the Muslims drove the Crusaders out in 1187, it went right back to being a mosque, which was just a matter of taking the altar out. But, so I don't know what it looks like on the inside, because I didn't see it.
So
There's a
I
big
didn't
one.
realize, so the Christians had control of it at one point.
Mm-hmm. This was a church. For about 200 years, during the Crusader period, this was a church. And it basically looked like
makes
that.
sense. I just didn't.
Yeah, and the Crusaders did that in a lot of places. They just took the mosques and took down all the Muslim symbols and turned them into churches.
How big is that? I'm trying to, in perspective wise, is it like 3 of these churches or, I mean, it's.
Bigger than that.
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge.
Big.
Bigger than that. All right, this is a person. That little black dot's a person, and then that's the building. So, It's big. I mean, it's like a basketball arena, I would say, a small basketball arena. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is actually the place of regular worship on the Temple Mount. This is the third holiest site in Islam, by the way. I don't know if I said that a minute ago. There's Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, most specifically Temple Mount. And we were there during the pilgrimage season. So we were there with Muslim pilgrims who were there visiting the sites associated with Islam, which was kind of neat. I don't have time for a longer story, but my friend Michael ended up having a long conversation with Muslim pilgrims in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is cool. But, so this is Al-Aqsa Mosque. A mosque was been there since the Muslim conquest in the 600s. But this mosque, more or less as you see it now, has been there since 1187. Saladin built it when he restored the Temple Mount to Muslim worship. So, good. So now we don't know where the temple would have been exactly, like where the Holy of Holies would have been. They think it was actually sort of behind where the Dome of the Rock is now. That the Holy of Holies would have been back behind the building itself. But they haven't done very much renovation, any like archaeological excavation right there because it is such a sensitive place. It would lead to a lot of trouble. All right, so this is another shot. Now we're looking at the Western Wall. Sometimes you've heard it maybe called the Wailing Wall. So the Western Wall was all that's left. The Romans destroyed the temple, as we talked about, around 70 AD. And this Western Wall, this retaining wall, is basically all that remains of the temple complex. So if we go back to look at our picture, these outer walls, the western one of those is all that remains, the lower part of it. The back one, yeah. And so it is considered the holiest site in Judaism because it's the only connection they have to the temple still. And it is a place of prayer. Boys are bar mitzvahed there. We saw a bar mitzvah while we were there, which is kind of neat. On the airplane, the ride over there, I sat next to a kid who was going to his cousin's bar mitzvah from New Jersey. I said, "Does your cousin live in Israel?" No. But they were Americans going to Israel for their bar mitzvah. I'm like, I don't know what your daddy does, but he must be real good at it. You know. Interestingly, this in the distance, this is the Mount of Olives. We'll talk more about that later, but you're looking over at the Mount of Olives. So it's because all the faith things, all the Jewish things in Israel, they basically write them so whatever flavor of Jew you are, you won't have a problem with it. Which means the Western Wall is segregated by gender. So this left-hand side is for men, and this right-hand side is for women. And if you go, there are prayers written and stuck in the cracks, and they every once in a while they come and clean them out. But but anyway, it's a really neat place. Men have to cover their heads, whether you're Jew, and you don't have to be Jewish to get. A Christian can go there, a Muslim cannot. Again, it's about keeping the peace. And you have to cover your head when you're there as if you were in a synagogue. See, there's me. That's one of my selfies. But there's me wearing my yarmulke. They have a little thing. You just pick one up and put it on. But you can see how big the blocks are. And people there praying. Now, outside, so if we go back to our diagram. Here is what the steps we're going to look at in a minute would be right here. This was the main entrance, these steps, for the everyday person into the temple complex at the time of Jesus. And that area has been excavated. This is that area right here. These are the steps right here that I'm about to show you now other parts of this are other things related to the temple, like there are mikvahs in here. I told you, remember the ritual baths we saw at Qumran? There are mikvahs here that pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims, would have had been part of their cleansing before they went into the temple complex.
Thomas, back there, when you go back to the western wall, right there, if you're standing looking at the wall, directly to the left, we went back
Oh, into that tunnel?
tunnel there. And did you go in there and look at all
I
that?
did. I went back in there and looked at it, and I started to feel like I wasn't supposed to be there, but I went all
I
the
know,
way
I
to
had
the
same
end.
thing. Yeah, there's, and I asked our guide about it, and that's one place they are excavating. They're sort of tunneling under
Right.
the Temple Mount.
They are.
Yeah.
And it's controversial, but you
Yeah.
can go in a tunnel, and there's about another, I think, like 100,000 feet
Oh, it's all
of
way back
wall
there, yeah.
excavated back in there. So you're basically looking at the foundations of it, and you can pray, and they have it. At the end of it, it kind of becomes like a synagogue. I mean, they've got prayer books, and the rabbinical council maintains it sort of as a library / synagogue / chapel.
So you
That is.
enter that wall there on the left, and you can go
Right
back
here.
1,000 feet.
I
Yeah.
think I read it was 1,000 feet.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It goes way back in there, and you're just under Jerusalem. But the more I don't know how to say it, but the further you go, the more Jewish it gets, you know, and you just feel like you're not. I
Yeah,
mean,
there's some real Orthodox people in there.
yeah. And so all right, so to the teaching steps, the top of these steps. So we looked at the big picture. Well, hold on. I don't want to go back that far, but we looked at the big picture down at the excavated area. These are the steps. There was a gate here. And these steps would have gone up into that gate, and you would have continued going up sort of through there and come out at the top of Mount, or at the top of the Temple Mount. This would have been the primary way into the temple at the time of Jesus. They're called the teaching steps because not just Jesus, but other rabbis, including Jesus, would have taught their disciples on these steps. I mean, they would have disciples would have sat around and the steps, and Jesus would have stood and taught them, or they might have sat and used it sort of like bleachers. We don't know what it looked like, but we know this was a site of teaching, and that Jesus definitely taught here. When we read about Jesus teaching in the temple, this is where it happened. When Jesus went into the temple complex, these are the steps he used. So, and again, this is one of those historical, not traditional sites. This is one, if you touch the stones of these steps, you are touching steps that Jesus walked on, that Jesus himself trod.
Thomas, was there a stone?
There was one stone, right, and that's it right there.
Okay.
That's the one that I'm standing on that can be definitively dated to the time of Jesus. So if you touch that stone, you are touching a rock that Jesus walked on. That's an Angry Birds yarmulke I saw in a store that I really almost bought. I hadn't played Angry Birds in a long time, but just thought it was funny that they make yarmulkes obviously for children, you know. So I guess you'll be a grown man with a Angry Birds yarmulke. But so that's the stone. We all stood on that stone, and so that's one of those places that we can say historically, archaeologically, with certainty Jesus was. This, because it would have got, yeah. All right. Any questions about the temple? All right. So the next place we're going to talk about is the Church of St. Anne. It belongs to a French order. Now, who is St. Anne, you're asking? The Bible does not tell us who the parents of Mary, the Virgin Mary, were. But tradition tells us that they were Anne and Joachim. Anne is actually the anglicized version of Hannah. So Hannah and Joachim. Or the westernized, I shouldn't say anglicized, Romanized, I guess, for better, because the French call it St. Anne too. But Hannah in Hebrew has become Anne in Western languages. And Anne and Joachim were the parents of Mary by tradition. And this church is built where her house is supposed to have been. Again, that's all extra biblical. That's all outside the Bible. But this is, architecturally, this is one of the neatest places we saw. This church was built in 1138. It's a Crusader church, and it has the most incredible acoustics anywhere ever. Probably made you sing there.
Yeah.
And so it is also beside the Bethesda pools, which we'll talk about in a minute. Well, let's talk about the pools first. So here's the church from the side, and here are the Bethesda pools. I want to read from John 5, 1 through 13. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. So this would have been just outside the sheep gate, one of the gates of the old city. So the walls, they're not modern, but the walls you see around the old city now are not the walls at the time of Jesus. They were later built. In these porticos, lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, he said to him, "Why do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take up your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, It is the Sabbath. Is it not lawful for you to carry your mat?" He answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said it to you, 'Take up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. Therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. So that's where that happened. And these pools were believed they would bubble at times, and it was, natural artesian well kind of thing. But it was believed that an angel was coming down and stirring up the water. And if you could go into the water while it was moving, there were healing properties. And so that's what we read about happening there. And it's a popular place when you visit the Holy Land to pray for healing, to pray for people who are in need of God's healing. So it's preserved as part of the complex that's St. Anne's Church. That's the interior kind of looking up, and I like the picture of looking up because you're able to see the vaulted domes. As a Crusader church, I'm going to nerd out on architecture for a minute. See how the arches are kind of pointy, but not really? They're not really Gothic arches like you would see in cathedrals, say, built 100, 200 years later in Europe. At the same time, they're not rounded arches that you would have seen from the time before this. So this is a time of architectural transition. You're seeing European architectural transition from Byzantine arches to Gothic arches in the Middle East. But what you're looking at, the way these domes are, the way these columns, what's the right word, Smith? Vaults, there we go. The vaults over the arches, the way it comes off the columns, it creates so that sound travels, so you don't need any amplification. Now you see, this is the same area looking from the ground level. If you were to stand behind the altar, this apse, and that's what you call that area back there, architecture is an apse, is a huge sounding board. And even if you stand further out, the sound travels. You can sing in that space, and the moment you stop singing, the sound just disappears. There's no echo.
Recording of it.
Yes.
don't get really good perception.
I know, that's right.
No.
Around and around and around.
Oh, no.
I'll try to let it go, see if it.
Okay, well, if it comes up, let us know, Jim, so we can listen to it. But Laura Allen was one of the female pastors sang and led us in singing there, and it was just incredible.
This is her.
Oh, okay.
If we can get it to. Maybe we should all go stand outside.
We'll go watch it on the porch, but it's just, I told you that there were two churches if I were to build a church.
It's hard to tell there, but it was just, it would give you goosebumps.
Mm-hmm. The sound quality of that space, I mean,
You sounded great.
yes.
That was the room, I think this is, the floors comes up, I think this is her by herself, I'm sure. Going around and around.
Let us know if it comes back. But that gives you an image of the space. I told you that the two churches, if I could build an exact replica of a church, one of them would either be, I said this is the second one. The first one was the church at Tabga, the site of the multiplication of loaves and fishes. This is the second one. This is not, if you read church growth tech books and things, it doesn't tell you to build a church this way, but I do it anyway. Build a building like that. Maybe just for me. The next place I want to talk about is St. Peter Gallicantu. Now, St. Peter, false disciple, Gallicantu is basically from Italian for the rooster crows. St. Peter of the singing rooster. So this is where, if you remember the story, Peter, it is Caiaphas' house. Peter, it was decided, Jesus told Peter he would deny him 3 times. Peter said, "No, Lord, I wouldn't do that." After he does it the 3rd time, he hears a rooster crow, as Jesus predicted. And this is the site of Caiaphas, the high priest's palace. And so this is where Peter would have heard the rooster crow for the 3rd time. After he denied Jesus the 3rd time. If you look at the cross on top of the church, I've got a more close-up picture for you. It's a rooster. Just little things like that are. This is something totally aside. You see these black things on the roof of every house? Those are hot water tanks. Those are water tanks, and beside every one is a solar panel. And that's how they heat water for their house. I think it's pretty smart. You live in the desert. If you live in the Isle of Palms, you don't need hot water in the summertime. It's always hot. But anyway, I wanted you to see the rooster. I did not take that picture, y'all. That one is one I found online. But a word about the church itself. The first church was built here in the 5th century. The current church was built in 1931. So this is another one of those sort of 20th century wave of constructions we see. But when you enter the church, this church is built over, and I'll show you the pictures of it in a minute, the dungeons, the prison that are carved into the rock below it. That Caiaphas would have been part of Caiaphas's official stuff supervising these prisons. And so the church itself, again, is built without, there are no windows. There are these incredible mosaics, but no windows. So that you have the feeling of sort of being in a cell or in a cave, or the caves that were used as cells. Another picture of the church itself, and you see again mosaics covering the walls. It's just one of those things that pictures can't do justice to. They were so. The one area of light are these stained glass windows over the altar, this arc of stained glass, and then a cross with this hole of stained glass right at the top of the dome of it is really so that the only light's coming from above, and that's going to make more sense in a minute. Beneath the church, directly beneath the sanctuary, there's a chapel, and in that chapel is this hole. This is an old cistern that seems to have been used as a cell at the time of Caiaphas. this hole is the only way in and the only way out. Carved into the lip, you can just barely see, are Byzantine crosses. So we know that in the era of the first 500 years of Christianity, something sacred was considered to have happened here because crosses have been carved into the opening there. And it's surmised that this is the cell in which Jesus was held the night before he was crucified. That the only way in or out was through this hole. They would have lowered a rope down there that you put under your shoulders and they pulled you out and or lowered you back in. That's the only way in or out. So when Jesus was arrested and tried at Caiaphas's palace, when he was in prison before his trial, this is where he would have been held. You can go, they've since cut stairs into the cistern, and you can go down in there. This is looking from the floor of the cell of the cistern up. This is just carved out of living rock. This is not like cement or mortar. This is just carved out of the living rock. That's not our group, but that's another group to give you a sense of what it was like. I mean, the size of it. These are the stairs that go down into it. So if you draw a line right here, you kind of have the size of the place. But imagine no illumination, no light of any sort, alone. The only way out is up. Reminiscent of that light from the dome, at the top of the dome in the church itself. This is one of those places. Some archaeologists would say that Caiaphas's palace was somewhere else, and I think they're wrong. This is one of those places you feel the presence of God in a powerful and real way. To touch these stones is to touch the stones Jesus touched. After he had his, we read in the Gospels of Jesus' emotional and spiritual torment in the garden before he was arrested. I imagine that spiritual and emotional torment continuing as he was in here in absolute darkness with no way out, awaiting to be tried before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. So that is in the same, under the same church, and it's a powerful experience. After he was tried at Caiaphas's palace, Jesus would have walked to the Antonia fortress to be tried before Pilate. These steps are from that time. And so again, as certain as we can be historically and archaeologically, Jesus would have left Caiaphas's palace and walked down these steps across the Kidron Valley, come across the old city of David to go up the other side to be tried before Pilate. That's a view of them now. When I was there the first time, you could walk on those steps. They've since closed it off, and now you have to walk beside them. But that gives you a sense of the church and the steps. Y'all walked on them?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we walked on them in 08.
Yeah,
And they're
wow.
going everywhere.
Yeah, I'm still wearing that.
So, but I guess probably to preserve them. People may have been trying to chip away pieces of them and things.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's St. Peter Gallicantu, one of my favorite places that we visited both times. I'm going to close tonight by talking about the old Jericho Road. So if we go back to the map, here's Jerusalem. Where'd Jericho go? Can't look sideways. Here's Jericho. So here's Jericho, here's Jerusalem. And obviously, there was a road between them. Now, the road that you go now was built, basically built after World War II. It feels like a interstate, except that there are Bedouin camps along the side of it, which you don't see on interstates in America. But before they built that in the 50s, there was basically a little 2-lane mountain road that you took from Jerusalem to Jericho, and this is it. We drove on that road, not all the way back to Jerusalem. You can still go that way, but it's funny. We saw, like, we passed ravines with cars at the bottom. Now I'm convinced the Ministry of Tourism goes and changes that car out every 3 or 4 years so the tourists can point at it. But what I'm getting at is you're riding out into the middle of nothing. I've never driven, well, I have driven out. I've driven out west where I've gone like 60, 75 miles without seeing another soul. If you've ever driven out west like that, this is kind of what that feels like. Only the road is a little more rickety. I don't know the right word. It's paved, it's asphalt, it's maintained, but it's narrow, and we were in a great big old tour bus, and I don't know, I had the feeling of what would I do if we met another tour bus. Somebody's gonna have to back up. Now, I did not go this before. Mike and Lee, did y'all do this when you were there before? This was an add-on. This is just something that Louie and I and the other 2 pastors got to talking and decided we'd do. So you're in the Judean desert here. So we are, in this area right here. And we go to an overlook, and you're in the middle of the desert, and we go to an overlook. So we were on the road, the old road, and this little line right here, this is the really old road. This is the road from the time of Jesus. You can walk it now as a trail, and Jim and Ann and I were talking the other day at the Walk for Water about wanting to go back and hike this. But so I read this, we look at this old road, and a couple of things come to mind for us. When Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he's talking about a man traveling on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, this is the road he would have had in mind. This is the road his first hearers would have had in mind. Desolate, through the desert. It's isolated in 2018. I can't imagine what it would have been like in 18. And you look at it, and it just looks like the kind of place where bandits would be hiding and robbers, and you see the barrenness of the desert all around it. And so also there's some biblical scholars have thought when the psalmist wrote Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this might be what they had in mind because of just the cultural cues. So let's read Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The valley of the shadow of death, the Lord leads me beside still waters. This is a wadi, a creek, that it sometimes has water in it, sometimes doesn't. But when you consider the desolation that's around it, then you can tell there's water because it's green. This is a modern aqueduct, by the way, this other line, so it would not have been there. But now the overlook where we were, you look down into it, you see the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. George.
Yeah.
And that's it. There's been a monastery there since the 5th century. That one is not from the 5th century. It's been destroyed a couple of times, rebuilt a couple of times. But you see again the road right here.
I remember the monastery now.
Now, did you see that? Okay.
Yeah, so we did, we remember.
You can go down to the wadi. There's the monastery closer up. See the solar panels? I think they don't pay there. They don't have SCE and G over there.
So, some sense of how long is this road that we're looking at?
That seems right, 22 miles.
Wow.
It's about a day's journey. 20 miles was considered a day's journey and with that terrain in that place, so it would have been a day's walk.
Wow.
All days walk.
An all day's walk, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've done some serious hiking, but I've never gone 20 miles in a day. I've never also hiked on flat land, but seriously anyway. But so that's the monastery there. But you get a sense of the scale of the place. To me, it was the one place I wish we could have. And to stand there, just see the hill sort of disappearing into barrenness.
All 22 miles are kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
And you
wow.
come out of, you basically in out of this canyon and you're at Jericho. The hills stop and you're at Jericho. Wadi Kelt is the name of the creek, the Wadi. And it's a little footpath now. I mean, it's a nice path, and you can go down and visit that monastery. We did not, but I would like to. The earliest monks had a habit of, they intentionally would put their monasteries in the most out of the way places, so that they would be free. I mean, the whole idea is I'm escaping the world and going off to spend the rest of my life in prayer, trying to grow closer to God. So to do that, you go off into the wilderness. The very first monastics were actually called the Desert Fathers and Mothers because they would go off into the desert.